Unique people leading unique lives shape and inform Iowa City. This community is enhanced by these women and men who live in our midst, working, teaching, creating. Welcome to a series of conversations with people who have stories to tell. Join my guests and me, Ellen Buchanan, in a series of interviews called One of a Kind. My guest on One of a Kind is the longtime Iowa City resident Bob Downer, a lawyer, community and state volunteer, member of the Iowa Board of Regents, past presidents of the Iowa State Bar Association, the Iowa City Chamber of Commerce, the Rotary Club, Sunrise Omnibus Club, and the Iowa City Public Library Board of Trustees. He served as a trustee of the Oak Knoll Foundation, former member of the Iowa Law School Board of Directors, chaired the Iowa City Area Development Group, and is currently a trustee for the Hoover Presidential Library Association. In addition, Bob is a member of the Board of Directors of the University of Iowa Research Foundation. Born in Colfax, Iowa, he graduated from the University of Iowa in 1961 with a BA in political science and served as a student body president. 3 years later, he received his law degree from the University of Iowa. Bob Downer is a Hawkeye through and through. He and his wife Jane raised 2 children in Iowa City, Elise and Andrew, and they have 2 grandchildren, Maeve and William, and 1 on the way. Welcome to One of a Kind.
Thank you.
Your story, like I said, begins in Colfax. Tell me about, I think in 1939, tell me about your first family and their influence.
I was an only child. My father was a graduate of what was then the Des Moines College of Pharmacy, which existed as an independent institution before it was absorbed by Drake. It's now the Drake School of Pharmacy. I remember him telling a story during the Depression that he determined that if he was able to purchase a pharmacy and gross $30 a day, that he could make it. And he found this store in Colfax and purchased that. And we lived there from my lifetime, 1939 until 1946.
And after you graduated, your grandfather, I read, wanted you to go to Iowa State, is that right?
That is correct.
And what went in your decision to come to Iowa?
I was very conflicted between whether I wanted to pursue law or engineering of some form that related to building construction, structural or civil or construction engineering. I moved more toward the law, which was something that my mother had strongly encouraged. And then when I was a junior in high school, my grandfather had an accident and determined that unless I was willing to come in and take over his business, he was going to sell out. And I thought about it for a few days and finally decided that I probably was more interested in pursuing a career in the law, and so that decision essentially was made before I got out of high school.
Before you got out of high school.
Fortunately, at that time it wasn't nearly as difficult to get admitted to law school as it is today, so I had pretty good assurance that I'd be able to at least get into law school.
Well, you brought this great picture, getting back to the drugstore, that did you get to work in the drugstore at all?
Oh yes, I learned how to make ice cream sodas and malted milks and all of those things. And the drugstore actually had quite a history to it. It was established in 1873 and closed in December of 2011 because the couple that then owned it was ready to retire and couldn't find purchasers who were willing to put in the hours that were involved. But there were only 6 owners in the 138-year history of the store, and so it was almost like a death in the family when that occurred.
And the name of it was?
Downer Rexall Drugs.
Downer Rexall Drug. So you came to the University of Iowa. You were very successful, and you became student body president in 1960. I mean, this was a time internationally, the Vietnam War, nationally, the civil rights movement. Was there unrest on the campus in '60 when you were president, or what were the students?
It was starting, but it had not really gelled into anything very significant at that point. One thing that happened during the time that I was student body president was the 1960 presidential election. And one trivia question that I sometimes ask people when we're reminiscing about that time, there was a mock election conducted on all 10 Big Ten campuses then that was part of an organized effort. And my trivia question is, how many of those campuses were carried by John Kennedy, and how many were carried by Richard Nixon? And the answer is Nixon 10, Kennedy 0.
Really?
And so at that point, we were still somewhat in the relatively calm period that where a lot of the things that occurred in the 60s hadn't really germinated to a great degree.
So you decided to go, like you said, into law school, graduated, and then you went into trusts and wills, and you joined a law firm in 1969. That's 45 years ago, right?
That's when I became a partner. I actually have always been affiliated with the same group that I am still with. I was employed by Bill Mearden in 1963, right out of law school. Became a partner as of January 1, 1969.
69. And who else were your partners in 69?
Bill Supple, Bill Mearden, and myself were the 3 at that time. Ansel Chapman had been in the firm at the time I joined. He was appointed to the district court bench just shortly before I became a partner.
That's good history of that firm. How did you meet your wife, Jane? Because people should know that she's also a contributor to the community and loyal and generous herself.
She was attending the University of Iowa and was working at the Iowa State Bank. First as the assistant to Walter Schmidt, and then when he retired to Dick Somerville. And I had a number of dealings with the bank and with Dick, and had a lot of contact with Jane through that, and the relationship developed from there.
And you got married in?
May of 1971.
1971. Well, I was looking at your curriculum vitae, and you have been deeply involved in so many organizations in Iowa City. How do you choose what you're going to give your time and talent to?
Well, first off, my son attributes that to my being one of the least athletic people on the planet. And he says that I have needed something to take up my time, and where others were more gifted in sports such as golf and tennis, I was not, and so I guess I took up the time by getting involved in various sorts of community endeavors. I don't know that there is any particular formula as far as things that I've gotten involved in. I've always had a strong interest in politics, really since I was about in junior high. and my experience in student government at the University of Iowa really caused a strong interest in higher education to develop, and that's one that I've maintained to the present time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to just read. I don't want to embarrass you. I know you're modest about these things, but I want to list your awards that you've received over the years, and I only mention a few that I think the viewers should know about. Bob won the Alumni Achievement Award in 2013, the Award of Merit, the Iowa State Bar Association in 2001, Outstanding Young Religious Leader, the Iowa City JCs, Service to Mankind Award, the Iowa City Sertoma Club, Who's Who in American Law, Excellence in Service Award from the Legal Services. I love this one, Boss of the Year from the Johnson County Legal Secretaries Association, and Estates and Trust Lawyer of the Year. Whew. I imagine people are shaking their heads and said, when does this man sleep? So that's quite a list of awards for all your time and energy.
Well, I think part of that may be attributable to the community in which I've been privileged to live. A part of it is certainly attributable to my father and my maternal grandfather in particular, both of whom were very involved in community affairs. My father was a school board member, was a Chamber of Commerce president. My grandfather was a longtime city council member, and I was raised with a strong sense of
service?
Community service, responsibility, and so it, I guess, comes naturally from my background.
Well, then maybe you've answered the question, or maybe there's more. I always ask my guests who has had a major influence on you, and I would.
There have been so many people that it's very difficult to know where to start. Certainly, my parents and my maternal grandparents, my paternal grandparents lived a further distance away, and my paternal grandfather died when I was quite young, and so I didn't have as close a relationship with them. There were a number of teachers that I had in elementary and secondary school. I oftentimes tell people that I've never managed to escape the influence of my high school English teacher.
What was her name? Do you remember?
Bernice Schreiber.
Bernice.
And I still find myself, when I'm listening to speeches, diagramming sentences and things of that nature. She was just a real taskmaster in terms of rules, of grammar, and things of that sort, which I've been very indebted to her for the great job of teaching that she did. And there were others in the school who had very positive influences on me as well. Same thing was true at the university, probably more, excuse me, more so in law school than as an undergraduate. To be truthful, I was not the most serious undergraduate student that ever came through the University of Iowa, because at that time, as I mentioned earlier, the requirements to get into law school were not terribly rigorous, and so I was able to spend a lot of time in student government and other probably less laudable endeavors and still get into law school. But Professor Vestal was a tremendous teacher and someone who influenced me greatly. Sandy Boyd certainly would be one that I would put at the very top of people who've had a profound influence on me.
What did he teach you? What did Sandy Boyd teach you?
He taught a course called Business Associations, which was corporations, partnerships, and other forms of business entities, taught corporate finance, and a course called Modern Social Legislation. But he was, in my mind, just an exemplary teacher as he was as a higher education leader and in every other endeavor that I've ever known that he's engaged in. And I had the good fortune of having him for several courses before he went off to become provost and then president of the university and then off to the Field Museum.
So you've had quite a long and abiding friendship with Sandy Boyd,
Yes,
haven't you?
certainly have.
Yes. Before we get to your the Board of Regents, I know people I've talked to about you said you are an avid Hawkeye fan. Do you go to all the games, all the football games, some of the games? Do you go out of town? Do you go to basketball games? Where are you?
The answer is pretty close to yes,
yes,
on all
yes.
of those. I have had season tickets in football and men's basketball for almost a half century. Have had women's season basketball tickets since Lisa Bluter arrived, and unless I have something that takes me out of town, I go to all of the home games in those sports. Typically will get to one or two out of town football games, occasionally basketball, have gone to most of the bowl games, and that's in my mind one of the great things about living in Iowa City, that
Right.
I really enjoyed that part of life here.
All right, let's talk about the Board of Regents that you've been on. How many years now? It's
A little over 11.
11 years. And you told me before the interview that you have less than a year left.
Correct.
Which is very sad for us. But what would you say to the viewers are the one or two or three biggest issues in the last 11 years and just recently that you've had to deal with as a regent?
Well, I think the biggest single issue is the change in the mix of funding for higher education between state appropriations and tuition. And the portion provided by state appropriations has declined substantially really since about 1980. And I think that's very unfortunate, in part because of the fact that Iowa's wage scale for persons with college degrees and in the professions tends to be somewhat lower than is true nationally. And as a result, I think it's important to keep higher education affordable in Iowa if we are going to continue to replenish the supply of persons that we need in the business and professions that are critical to the state. And while some point to the cost of living being lower in Iowa, that doesn't have anything to do with repayment of student loans. As I've taken to saying, it costs just as much to repay a student loan whether you live in Mason City or New York City.
Right.
And I think that the fact that higher education has not, in my opinion, been adequately funded for some time has been counterproductive insofar as the state's interests are concerned in replenishing our workforce.
Are you at all optimistic that this could shift and change?
Well, there are certainly some positives in this. Well, one of which is the great generosity of alumni and friends of all of the public universities to support their programs through contributions. The University of Iowa, as you know, is engaged in a drive where they have raised over $1.2 billion to date. At the end of President Skorton's tenure, they had concluded another drive that was $1.065 billion. Those are the two largest fund drives in the history of the state of Iowa. And Iowa State has had one, I know, that has gone over $800 million. UNI is not as fortunate, both because of the size of the institution and the fact that many of their older alumni have been in K-12 education and not able to contribute as generously.
Sure.
But that has certainly helped. And there are some programs that are doing quite well, but it's a constant struggle to keep up with costs. There is an index that the business school at the University of Iowa maintains called the Higher Education Price Index, which is a market basket of goods and services that universities purchase, just like the Consumer Price Index is for consumers. That has over time risen more rapidly than the Consumer Price Index, and it's been hard to keep up with inflationary pressures.
How do you keep politics out of the Board of Regents? Or do
Well,
you? Or is that a naive question?
For the most part, we have. In the 11 years that I've been on the board, there has been only one straight party line vote that has occurred, and that was on the project labor agreement for the Iowa River Landing medical clinic. But I think that it works better in Iowa than it does in most states. Even though there have been some significant differences of opinion on the board over time, I do think that all of our board members have been well informed and have been people who have had a broad view of what the universities really should be accomplishing. They have not been single issue people, which has been a problem, I know, in some states, particularly those where they've had popular elections of their boards. So I think by and large the system has worked pretty well.
What has that taught you in the 11 years? Have you learned any lessons from being on this board personally?
Well, for one thing, probably the main thing that I have learned and something that I was generally aware of, but it certainly reinforced it, is the number of incredibly talented people there are as students, as faculty and staff members, as alumni, as people who have worked hard to build these institutions. You can't be involved without just really feeling good about those efforts. While I think I've been aware of these in the past, have never had occasion to think quite as much about them as I have since I've been on the board.
Let's move to something that's dear to your heart. Near and dear where are your two children, and what are they doing and what they're about?
Our daughter Elise lives in University City, Missouri.
Oh, nice.
Is married to an orthopedic surgeon whom she met when he was in his residency at the University of Iowa, and she was in law school here. They have two children. Our granddaughter Maeve, who is 6.5, and our grandson Theo, goes by his middle name, and he's a little over 4. Our son, Andrew, got married last June. He is a lawyer with a firm in Chicago, but is living in Portland, Oregon, which with technology seems to work. Our daughter-in-law is a lawyer for Nike there. They both practice trademark and copyright law.
Well, the apple does not fall too far from the tree with 2 lawyer children. That's great. Do you have any downtime, and what do you like to do in your downtime, if you have any downtime?
Oh, I read a lot.
What's on your bedside table?
A book on the 2012 presidential election. I got it for Christmas. I can't recall the name of it right offhand. Our daughter in particular is very critical of me, says that I need to read more fiction.
Rather than nonfiction.
Right, but I don't do a very good job at that.
Well, maybe when you step down from the Board of Regents, you'll have a little bit more spare time. You've lived here, like I said, for years and years and years, coming in 1957, correct?
Correct.
What are some of the most favorite things you like about this community?
Well, I think it is, in my mind, a very friendly community. It's easy to get acquainted. That there is a lot of the best term I can think of is cross-fertilization of groups that might, in some communities, be more isolated and insular. But it's easy to get to know a wide variety of people here. I think Iowa City combines many of the attributes of a large city and a small town. People are still very caring for one another, rally round in times of difficulty. But yet there's a high level of sophistication here too. Statistics that I've seen show that this is one of the 4 or 5 best educated communities in the country, which I think speaks well for it and would improve the quality of life anywhere. And it's close to a lot of metro areas if one wants to get away for a weekend. And so just not very many things about it that I would find fault with.
Except maybe the winter weather, some winters.
That's right,
some winters.
Particularly this last winter.
My last question, do you think you'll ever not be involved in some sort of organization in Iowa City and completely retire, or is that not your path?
There are a couple of people that I have over the years heard make comments about retirement that I think are worthy of consideration. One being Sandy Boyd, who has said never retire. I'm not sure that I'd go quite that far. The other one I remember was at a party about 30 years ago. I asked the late Dr. Schrock when he was planning to retire, and he said he didn't know for sure, but he wanted to quit while there were still a few people who wanted him around. and I thought that showed great insight on his part, and I would hope to be able to make that same call. But I don't know when it's going to be. Well,
on that wonderful positive note, I thank you for being my guest today.
My pleasure.
My guest on One of a Kind has been Bob Downer, a man who has given much to our community and state, a trust and estate lawyer, a recipient of innumerable awards, husband, father, grandfather. Words used to describe my guest are respected, committed, engaged, reflective, thorough, and who, above all else, bleeds black and gold. Bob Downer is one of a kind.